There is a kind of quiet that only comes to a hospital in the small hours, when the day's business has gone to sleep, and the long wards lie dim and even, and the only sound is the breathing of the sick and the soft tread of the one nurse left awake to keep them. It is a tender quiet mostly, and a watchful one. But in an old infirmary on the edge of a moor town, one winter, a young night nurse learned that there is another quiet that can live inside the first, a colder one, kept on the shut ward at the end of the upper corridor, where a nurse who is not there still does her round in the dead hour, decades after she died at her own work, still trying to reach the one bed she never got to. Good evening. Come in out of the dark and let me take your coat and draw your chair up close to the lamp, for the night has come down cold, and this is a story that keeps to the small hours, when there is nothing left awake in the house but you. I am the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for the whole of their lives, and I sit with each until it settles into something I can hand gently across to you. Tonight's story came to me from a woman who spent a single winter as a night nurse in an old cottage hospital away in the north, and who never afterward let a frightened soul go through the night alone if there was any way on earth to sit with them. So settle back into the warmth, and let me tell you about a shut ward, an empty bell, and a nurse who would not leave her round unfinished. The woman at the heart of it was young, newly qualified, and glad of any place that would take her. She had trained in a great city hospital, and when her training was done there was no post for her there. So when a small cottage hospital up on the moors wanted a night nurse for the worst of the winter, she took it gladly, and went up on the train into the cold, and did not think to ask why so small a place should be so short of nurses. She would come to understand, before that winter was out, that there is a loneliness which is only the want of company, and then there is a loneliness kept faithfully in one shut room for a very long time, only waiting for a kind heart to come near enough to feel it. The infirmary was an old one, and had been a grand gesture in its day, and was neither any longer, a tall gray building of blackened stone, with a clock over the door that had stopped. It had been built for more sickness than the town could now supply. The more villages had thinned, and so half its wards stood closed and sheeted and cold, their beds stripped to the iron, and the whole life of the place drawn down into the two low wards on the ground floor where the handful of winter patients lay. It was a lonely posting, and it did not trouble her at all. She was trained to the place in her first nights by the night sister, an older woman, spare and careful and kind in the plain way of women who have nursed the dying for 40 years. The sister showed her the wards, and the drug cupboard, and the book she was to write the night's doings in, and the bell-board where a little painted disc dropped to show which bed had rung. And then, on the last of those nights, before she went home to the town, the sister stopped her at the foot of the stair and told her the one thing that was written in no handbook. Put into my own words, it was this: the two low wards are yours, and the whole house at night. Go where you are rung and keep them. But at the top of the building, at the far end of the upper corridor, there is a ward that is shut, the old fever ward, they still call it, though there has been no fever in it for longer than either of us has been alive, and that ward you are to leave be. You are not rostered to it. No patient lies in it. And if ever in the dead hour you should hear a bell ring up from it where no bell can ring, or hear the old drug trolley wheeled along that corridor, or hear a nurse at her round up there where no nurse of ours is on, then you are to do one thing only. You are to note it in the book with the hour as those before you have noted it, and you are not to go up. You are not to answer that bell, and you are not, whatever your heart tells you, to go up and help her finish her round. The young nurse took the words for what they plainly sounded like, the sort of tale that grows over an old and half-empty building the way damp grows into its walls, handed down from one night nurse to the next because a lonely post wants a ghost to keep it, even a sad one. She thanked the sister, watched her go out into the dark toward the town, and then was alone with the sleeping house and the great cold hush of it settling round her like snow. That first night passed easy and quiet, and in the morning she thought it as gentle and harmless a place as a tired young woman could wish to be left alone in. That much was still true, It would not stay true for long. She kept the wards well through those first weeks, and I want to be fair to her about that because it matters to what came after. She was a good nurse and a brave one, and not at all a fanciful woman. She learned the little winter list of her patients. She trimmed the lamps and warmed the milk and answered every bell that dropped on the board, quick and quiet on her soft-shod feet. And by the small hours she would sit at the desk in the pool of the one lamp with her book, and think, as the young do, that the sister's warning had been only an old woman's kindness, dressing up an empty building for a stranger. It was on a hard, clear night deep in the first frost that she heard the bell for the first time. She was at the desk in the low ward, a little after 2 in the morning, at the dead low turn of the night when the sick sleep deepest, and the well can hardly keep their eyes open, when she heard, from somewhere far above her in the shut and sleeping house, a bell begin to ring. It was not the electric buzz of the boards she knew. It was an older sound, a small, clear, mechanical bell, the kind that used to hang on a coiled spring at a ward door and was set jangling by a wire from the bedside, the way the sick called the nurse in the days before the boards were put in. It rang once and stopped, and rang again, the patient, unhurried summons of someone who is in no panic but only wants the nurse to come, and is quite sure that she will. She sat very still and listened, and told herself all the things you would tell yourself. A water pipe knocking in the cold, the wind in a loose casement. But there was no wind that night. The frost had come down still and breathless, and the sound had a shape no pipe ever had. It rang and paused and rang, with the plain human rhythm of a hand on a bell pull. And it came from above, from the far end of the house, from the top of the building where the upper corridor ran away into the dark, toward the one ward that was shut. She got up and went out into the main hall where the great bellboard hung, and stood before it with her lamp held up. And every disc on it was still. Not one had dropped. Whatever was ringing far up in the cold hung on no wire that ran down to her. It was a bell in a room that had no patient to pull it. And still, above her head, faint and clear and patient, it went on ring and pause and ring, the summons of an empty bed that wanted the nurse to come. She remembered the sister then and the flat plain thing she had said, noted in the book, "Do not go up." And though her feet, trained to a bell as a good nurse's feet are trained, had already carried her to the bottom of the stair before she knew it, she stopped there with one hand on the cold rail and made herself go back. She took up her pen at the desk, and in a hand not quite as steady as she would have liked, she wrote down the hour and the fact of it, that a bell had rung from the upper floor, from the direction of the shut ward, where no bell could ring and no patient lay. And when she had written it and turned back through the book, she saw that she was not the first. It went back years in a dozen different hands, and scattered all down it night after winter night, were the same few plain words, set down by one night nurse after another. A bell on the upper floor, the trolley in the far corridor, noted and not answered. She was only the newest of them, and above her at last, as though it had said what it came to say, the little bell up in the dark gave over, and the house went quiet and stayed quiet till the gray came up. It came again the next week, and the week after, always on the coldest and stillest nights, always a little past 2, always from the far end of the upper floor. And after the bell on some of those nights came the other thing the sister had named, a slow, small, trundling sound, far up and far off, the unmistakable rattle and squeak of an old drug trolley wheeled along a hard floor, bottle against bottle, pausing every so often as a nurse pauses her trolley at a bed. She would sit at her desk with her pen still in her hand and listen to it go, the round of a nurse she could not see, on a ward where no nurse was rostered, wheeling her medicines patiently from empty bed to empty bed. And each time, the young nurse wrote it in the book, and did not go up. But each time it was a little harder not to. For there is nothing in the world that pulls so hard at a good nurse's heart as a bell she has not answered. She did not sleep well after that on her days, and I don't suppose any of us would have. She would lie in her lodging through the pale afternoons and hear, over and over, that small clear bell and that slow squeaking wheel, and grow, night by night, less afraid of the sound and more troubled by it. For it was not a frightening sound. It was a working sound, the sound of a nurse doing exactly what she herself did every night, and there was something in the faithfulness of it that reached past her fear and laid hold of something softer. So it was not terror that took her up the stair at last, on a bitter night in the deep of that winter. It was that she could not, in the end, bear to sit at her desk and listen to a bell ring and a round go on above her, and do nothing, and not even see. She went up when the bell began, up the cold stair with her lamp, to the top of the house where the upper corridor ran away long and straight into the dark. And at the far end, under the shut door of the old fever ward, there was a light, not the white of her own lamp, but a low, warm, yellow glow, the soft, steady light of an oil lamp turned down for the night, leaking out under the door toward her. And from behind it came the sound she knew, the small bell giving over now that someone had come, the slow squeak of the trolley, and under them both, very faint, a step. She went along the corridor slowly with her heart going hard, and when she came to the door, which stood a little ajar, she looked in through the gap. The old fever ward lay long and dim before her, 2 rows of iron beds down its length, every one of them stripped and empty, the mattresses bare, the lockers cleared, dust lying gray, and even over all of it in the way that dust only lies where no living hand has come for years. And down that ward of empty beds, in the pool of a single warm lamp, a nurse was doing her round. She was dressed in the fashion of a good many years past, the long gray gown of an older nursing, the deep white apron, the linen cap and cape of a night sister of another age. She had her back half to the door, and moved from bed to bed with the slow, sure care of a lifetime's practice, wheeling beside her a small old trolley of bottles and enamel that squeaked at one wheel. And she was nursing. That is the thing the young woman could never afterward forget, not that the ward was empty, but that the nurse was tending it as though it were full. At each stripped and dusty bed she stopped and bent, and did the small offices of the night over the bare iron. She seemed to smooth a cover that was not there, and raise a head to a cup, and lay the back of her hand against a brow. Her lips moved, though no sound came, in the low steady murmur a good nurse keeps up for the comfort of the frightened. And over the whole of it lay a peace so deep, and a tenderness so plain, that the young nurse at the door forgot for a while to be afraid, and only stood and watched, with the tears standing in her eyes, a woman keeping a nightful of empty beds with all the love in the world. But the peace was not whole, for there was a haste under the tenderness that grew as the nurse went down the ward. She tended each bed, but did not linger. She was working toward the far end, toward the last bed in the corner by the shuttered window, and every little while she would lift her head and look toward it, down in the deepest dark where her lamp scarcely reached, as a nurse looks toward the one patient she is most afraid for. And she never reached it. Each time she drew near the last bed, her round seemed to fold back on itself and begin again at the top, so that she was forever tending the beds between, and forever kept from the one in the corner. And the young nurse understood, watching, that this was not a peaceful round at all. It was a round that could not be finished, a woman trying, night after night, for longer than anyone living could remember, to reach one last bed in the dark and never being let. Her hand was on the door, and the cold of the ward breathed out past it against her face, and the nurse in her, the part that goes toward the frightened without asking leave, had already begun to push it open. And then the sister's words came back to her in the dark. Do not go up. Do not answer the bell. Do not help her finish her round. She took her hand from the door with her heart breaking a little and stepped back. And as she did, the nurse at the far end stopped her endless round and lifted her head, and turned not sharply, not in anger but slowly, the way a woman turns who has felt, without quite hearing it, that another nurse has come onto the ward. The young woman could not see her face clearly, and was glad of it, for what little she saw was not dreadful, but only tired past all telling, and sorrowful, and full of a mute and desperate asking. She drew back, and went down the long stair with her blood loud in her ears, and behind her the warm light kept its place under the door, and the trolley took up its patient squeak again, and the round went on. In the morning she did the only thing left to a sensible woman in her place, which was to go looking for the truth of it in daylight, among papers, where the dead keep quieter. Instead of going to her lodging to sleep, she found the little room off the boardroom where the infirmary kept its old books, and let herself in among the dust and the cold, and began to read. The infirmary had kept its records in a long, unbroken run of ward ledgers, where every patient's coming and going and dying was set down in a fair round hand, and beside them the matron's book. She read backward, looking for the thing she was half afraid she would find, and a long way back, in the ledgers of a winter more than 60 years gone, she found it. There had been a bad winter that year on the moors, a hard black winter of some spreading fever that came down out of the villages and filled the infirmary past its beds, so that the fever ward at the top of the house had been the very heart of it. Crowded, desperate, worked day and night by nurses who caught, one after another, the very sickness they were nursing. And among them, night after night through the worst of it, was one whose name the ledger gave, a nurse Ada Marrow, a woman not young, who had nursed in that house the better part of her life. The young woman read down the daily tally of the fevered and the dying in Nurse Marrow's plain faithful hand, until she came to the night the hand stopped. And the story of it, as she pieced it together from the ledger and the matron's book, and from what the old sister pressed at last would tell her, put into my own words and softened where it wants to be, was this. On the worst night of that worst winter, with the ward full and every nurse on it half dead on her feet, Nurse Ada Marrow had been doing her night round, going bed to bed with her trolley, tending the sick and comforting the frightened, working her way toward the last bed by the shuttered window. And in that last bed there lay an old man. He was a pauper of the parish, the ledger said, a man by the name of William Rush, with no wife living and no child and no soul in the world to come and sit by him. And he was very frightened and very near his end, and Nurse Marrow had promised him, for she was that kind of nurse that whatever else the night brought, she would come back down to him before it was over and be with him at the last, so that he should not go out of the world alone among strangers in the dark. She meant to keep that promise. But the fever she had nursed so long had come for her at last, and somewhere in the middle of that round, halfway down her own ward with her trolley in her hands, Nurse Ada Marrow was taken suddenly and terribly ill and fell, and was carried to a bed herself, and before the next night was out she was dead. And the old man in the last bed died that same night, alone. That was the thing the young nurse could not put down once she had read it. With every nurse run off her feet among the dying, and the one who had promised him struck down before she could come, old William Rush went out of the world in the small hours untended and unsat with, frightened and alone in the far corner, waiting for a nurse who never came, not because she forgot him, not because she failed of love, but because death reached her first and took her out of her round with her promise still in her hands and one bed still to go. They were buried within a day of each other, in the bad haste of that fever winter, out in the plot behind the infirmary where the parish laid its poor. The nurse under a small stone the house had paid for she had died in its service, and the old man with no stone at all, in an unmarked grave among the other paupers, unmourned and unnamed, because there was no one in the world to see it done and no time that terrible winter to do it. The last pages told the rest without meaning to, for down the years since ran that same thin faithful thread the young woman had already found the bell on the upper floor, the trolley in the far corridor, noted and never answered, night after cold night. And she understood it now, sitting there in the dust with the cold coming up through the floor. Nurse Ada Marrow was still on her round. She had been taken out of it before she could finish, with one promise unkept and one frightened soul left to die alone, and had never been let go of it since. She came back on the coldest nights to the ward where she had failed, and did her round over and over, never able to reach the last bed and keep the promise death had broken in her hands. She closed the books. She knew now what the poor soul wanted and why she could not rest, and what it would take to let her. That was the worst of it and the truest. She understood her perfectly. The worst night of that winter came a little before its end, and she knew it for a bad one from the moment the dark shut down, for it came with a still, hard, breathless cold, and the frost stood in the air like held glass. She had told herself through the day that she would keep to her own 2 wards and let the far ward keep its long grief without her. She did not keep to it. Something in the knowing of it now would not let her sit still. And when the little bell began that night, a little past 2, up in the cold, clearer and more urgent than she had ever heard it, ringing and ringing, no longer the patient summons of the other nights but a quick, pleading, desperate peal, as of a nurse who has rung and cannot make the one who should come. She was on her feet before she knew it, and already at the foot of the stair. She went up. She told herself it was only to look, only to note it truly in the book, but she went up, along the cold corridor to the shut door with its warm light beneath, and this time she pushed it open and stood upon the ward itself. And the moment she did, she felt it, the pull of the place, the whole long asking of it, come round her like the cold. For Nurse Ada Marrow was there in the pool of her lamp, and this night she was not merely tending. This night she had turned from the beds and stood in the middle of the ward, facing the door, facing the young living nurse who had at last come in. Her worn hands held out a little and her tired, sorrowful face lifted, and all the mute asking of 60 winters in it. She was asking for help, for another pair of trained and willing hands to take up the round with her, to wheel the trolley and tend the beds and go down with her into the far dark corner, and reach the last bed and keep the promise she had died with. She had waited 60 years for a nurse who would answer the bell and come up and help her finish. And she had decided, the young woman understood with a cold that went to the bone, that this was the one, that she was the nurse who would stay. And the pull of it, she told me, was very great and very sweet and very nearly kind. For here was the whole of what had made her a nurse, held out to her in the lamplight, a work of pure mercy, a soul to be comforted, a promise to be kept, and no more loneliness ever, only the 2 of them together on the quiet ward through the long nights, doing the tenderest work there is. Her hand had already gone out toward the handle of the trolley. She said the wanting of that poor faithful soul was so strong, and so like her own heart's wanting, that some part of her leaned toward it the way a tired nurse at the end of a long night leans toward a chair, past all thought of what the leaning would cost her. She was within a breath of going down that ward at Nurse Marrow's side into the far dark, and taking up the round, and never coming off it again, of standing where the poor soul stood, 60 more years on, holding out her own worn hands to some other young nurse at the door. And in the deep of her own mind, very faint, she could hear the little bell still ringing and asking her to stay. What stopped her in the end was not the sister's rule, and it was not fear. It was the thing she had read in the ledger and could not put down. That Nurse Ada Marrow was held to that ward not by love of the work, but by one promise broken in her hands by death, and that the keeping of it and nothing else could set her free. She understood, with her hand almost on the trolley, what the poor soul in the lamplight could not, that to take up the round now would finish nothing and free no one. It would only add herself to the grief, 2 nurses now instead of 1, going down and down a ward of empty beds forever and never let to reach the last. For the old man was not on the ward at all. He lay out in the cold ground behind the infirmary in an unmarked grave, untended and unnamed for 60 winters, exactly as he had died. That was the promise never kept, the one bed Nurse Marrow could never reach because it was not on her ward. It was in the earth. And it could only be reached by the living. And that, the young woman saw, was a thing she could do, not by taking up the trolley and not by staying, but by going back into the daylight world of the living, and doing with her living hands the one plain, merciful thing that 60 years of a faithful ghost had never had the power to do. So she took her hand back from the trolley, and did the hardest thing she had ever done, which was to turn from that poor pleading soul and not help her with her round. And she went as near the old woman as she dared, and told her in her own living voice, the voice a nurse keeps for the frightened, that the round was over now, and she need tend the empty beds no longer, for the young one would go down to the last bed in her stead, and keep the promise for her, and see the old man safely out at last. And whether the poor soul heard her or no, the young nurse could not say, but the little bell gave over its ringing and did not begin again, and the ward for the first time was wholly still. She kept the vigil that very night. She took a lamp out into the bitter cold behind the infirmary to the old pauper's plot, and by the matron's book and an hour's searching among the sunken, unmarked mounds, she found the place where William Rush had been laid in the fever winter and left. And there, in the dark and the killing frost, she did what Nurse Ada Marrow had been trying for 60 years to do. She sat the vigil with him that he had died without. She stayed by that neglected grave through the whole black heart of the night, as a nurse stays with the dying, and spoke to him gently, and told him he had not been forgotten, and was not alone, and that his nurse had never once stopped trying to come to him, and had sent her at the last in her stead. And when the gray light came up over the white and silent moor, she went in and took up the old ledger, and against the 60-year-old entry for the old man's death she wrote, in her own steady hand, the thing that should have been written that first cold night and never was, that the patient in the last bed had been sat with and comforted and seen out, that the promise made to him had been kept, and that his nurse might rest. And in the spring, when the ground gave, she had a small plain stone set over the grave at her own charge, with his name cut into it, and his years, and beneath them the only words she could think of that were wholly true, that here lay one who had died alone and was not forgotten, long promised a nurse at the last, and kept faith with at length by two. And the ward let its keeper go. The night after she had sat the vigil, she went up in the dead hour of her own will this time, and came to the shut door at the end of the corridor, and there was no light beneath it. She opened it and went in, and the old fever ward lay long and dim and empty, the dust gray, and even over the iron beds, the little trolley standing still against the wall, and there was no nurse at her round, and no bell, and no cold breathing asking out of the dark. Only down at the far end, in the last bed in the corner by the shuttered window, the young woman thought, though she could never afterward be sure, and told me so, that the thin frost on the bare mattress had been disturbed, very lightly, as though a tired hand had smoothed it flat one last time, the way a nurse settles a bed when its patient has gone at last quietly to sleep, and the long watch is over. And then even that was gone, and it was only a bed in an empty room in a sleeping house, with the dawn coming up cold and clean over the moor. She never heard the bell again. She kept out her winter and gave the whole of her long life to the work, but she told me, when she was very old, that of all she ever learned, the truest thing was learned that one cold winter from a nurse dead 60 years, who taught her, without a word, what it is to keep faith with the frightened. For the dead are not always out there to harm us. Sometimes they are only a tired nurse on an empty ward in the dead hour, going her round over and over, trying to reach one last bed and keep one promise that death took from her too soon. That's where I'll leave them and leave you, with the ward gone quiet, the promise kept, and an old man out on the cold moor no longer lying nameless and alone. If you'd sit up in the small hours for a story as tender as this one, then do me a kindness before you go. Like it, share it, and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the dark comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, was there ever a promise, or a watch, or a small last kindness owed to someone, that you would go a long cold way to see kept at last? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still out in the dark and faithfully at their work. And if you should ever wake, in some cold and quiet place in the small hours, to a bell you cannot account for ringing from a room where no one lies, a patient, asking bell, that seems to want you to rise and come and help, then be gentle, and heed the old rules as they are given to you. But do not be too quick to call it a haunting. Some of the waiting dead are only the faithful, kept from their rest by one kindness they were not let to finish. And the tenderest thing a living heart can do when the empty bed calls in the night is not to go up and take up the endless round, but to find the one last soul left unsat with, and sit with them and see them home, and let the good nurse lay her burden down at last and go. Good night.